Welcome to our deep dive into the world of ExxonMobil. You might know them as a gas station or maybe just a big name in oil, but their story goes way back, and it's way more complex than you might think. We're going to journey from the cutthroat days of John D. Rockefeller to today's world of climate change concerns and renewable energy.
What's truly captivating about ExxonMobil is that their story is practically a crash course in the history of the American energy industry, from kerosene lamps to gas-guzzling cars, and now the push for cleaner alternatives. It's a story of innovation, ambition, and let's face it, a fair share of controversy.
You know, whenever I hear Rockefeller, I can't help but picture him swimming in a pool of money, like Scrooge McDuck. But setting aside the cartoon imagery, the guy was a relentless businessman. Can you imagine controlling 90% of oil refining in the U.S.? That was Standard Oil in its heyday.
It's mind-boggling. Rockefeller was laser-focused on efficiency and control. He would buy up struggling refineries, undercut competitors to drive them out of business, even make secret deals with railroads to gain an advantage on shipping costs. He built this massive, vertically integrated empire that dominated the industry.
So how did he go from controlling almost everything to having his company broken up by the Supreme Court?
Well, in 1911, the Supreme Court declared Standard Oil a monopoly, violating the Sherman Antitrust Act. The court ordered it to be broken up into 34 separate companies. Now, you'd think that would be the end of Rockefeller's dominance, right?
I would assume so. You break up his company, you break up his power.
Not exactly, because he held significant shares in all 34 companies. And with their stock prices soaring, he actually ended up richer after the breakup. Estimates suggest his wealth multiplied several times over. Talk about a counterintuitive outcome.
Wow. I guess it really is true what they say. Sometimes you have to break a few things to make even more money.
That's a rather cynical way to put it, but there's a grain of truth in there. What's important to remember is that two of these fragments, Standard Oil of New Jersey and Mobil, eventually came back together to form the modern ExxonMobil we know today. It's like history rhyming, even in the world of big oil.
Okay, so we've got Rockefeller, his obsession with efficiency, the rise and breakup of Standard Oil, and this almost poetic reunion of two of its splinters into ExxonMobil. But where do they go from there?
ExxonMobil continued this trajectory of expansion and innovation. They pioneered offshore drilling, opening up vast new reserves. They pushed advancements in natural gas extraction, another major energy source. And they even dipped their toes into renewables like wind and solar, though that was admittedly a smaller part of their portfolio at the time.
I'm curious, though, what were some of the major milestones or innovations that really set them apart? I mean, there must have been some game changers along the way.
You're absolutely right. One standout example is their development of the first offshore oil rig. Before that, drilling was limited to land or very shallow water. This innovation opened up a whole new frontier for oil exploration, especially in places like the Gulf of Mexico. They were also pioneers in hydraulic fracturing, or fracking, a controversial but undeniably impactful technique for extracting oil and gas from shale formations.
Now, I can't talk about ExxonMobil without at least mentioning the elephant in the room, their environmental track record. I mean, the Exxon Valdez oil spill in 1989 is practically synonymous with environmental disaster. How did that event reshape the company's approach, if at all?
The Exxon Valdez spill was a watershed moment, forcing a reckoning not just for Exxon, but for the entire oil industry. The images of oil-soaked wildlife and miles of polluted coastline were seared into the public consciousness. It led to stricter regulations, increased scrutiny of industry practices, and a heightened awareness of the potential environmental risks associated with oil production and transport.
So they had this major wake-up call. But what about the whole climate change issue? Weren't there accusations that they knew about the link between fossil fuels and climate change, but actively downplayed or even denied it?
That's where things get really complicated and, frankly, a bit scandalous. Internal documents later revealed that Exxon scientists had been studying climate change since the 1970s, and their findings were pretty clear. Burning fossil fuels was contributing to global warming, yet publicly. Some executives, particularly former CEO Lee Raymond, cast doubt on the science.
That sounds almost like a deliberate attempt to mislead the public and protect their business interests. How do they reconcile that internal knowledge with their public stance?
Well, that's the million-dollar question. And it's one that has fueled lawsuits, protests, and investigations. ExxonMobil maintains they've always followed the science and that their past statements have been taken out of context. They've also pointed to their more recent commitment to net zero emissions by 2050 as evidence of their sincerity in addressing climate change.
Okay, so they're pledging to go net zero. But is that even realistic for a company so deeply rooted in fossil fuels? What concrete steps are they taking to make this happen? And how are people reacting to these efforts?
That's what we'll dive into next. Their journey from kerosene to combating climate change is still unfolding, and it's certainly not without its critics and challenges. So we've established that ExxonMobil has pledged to achieve net zero emissions by 2050, a target that has certainly raised eyebrows, given their history. It begs the question, how does a company so entrenched in the oil and gas industry actually plan to pull this off?
That's what I'm struggling to grasp. It sounds almost like a magician promising to make an elephant disappear. Where do they even begin? Is it all just talk? Or are they actually putting their money where their mouth is?
They're definitely investing in a range of technologies, and one of their most prominent bets is on carbon capture and storage, or CCS. Imagine this, capturing carbon emissions from industrial facilities before they reach the atmosphere, and then storing them deep underground.
Okay, I can vaguely picture that. But how feasible is it on a large scale? It sounds incredibly complex and probably expensive.
Right. You're hitting on the key challenges here. One of the major hurdles is the sheer scale of the infrastructure needed. We'd need a whole new network of pipelines, specifically designed to transport captured CO2. And we're not talking about your average pipeline. These would need to handle highly pressurized CO2, which requires specialized materials and construction.
Yeah, so basically, we'd be building a whole new energy infrastructure on top of the one we already have. That sounds like a logistical nightmare, not to mention the cost.
Exactly. One expert we spoke to estimated the cost of building these CO2 pipelines at around $300,000 per inch mile. That's not a typo. Per inch, per mile. It's a massive undertaking, both in terms of engineering and cost.
All right, so let's say they manage to overcome those obstacles and actually build this CO2 pipeline network. What happens next? Where does all that captured carbon actually go?
That's where the storage part of CCS comes in. The idea is to inject the CO2 deep underground, often into depleted oil and gas reservoirs or saline aquifers. These formations are porous and can trap the CO2 for centuries, effectively preventing it from reaching the atmosphere.
Okay, so we've got the capture, we've got the transport, and we've got the storage. But how do we even know if it's actually working? How can we be sure that the CO2 is staying put and not leaking back out?
That's a crucial question, and one that scientists and engineers are actively working on. Monitoring technologies are constantly evolving to detect leaks and ensure the long-term integrity of these storage sites. Think of it like a sophisticated security system for underground CO2 vaults.
So they're putting a lot of faith in this CCS technology. Are there other strategies they're exploring as part of their net zero plan? I mean, CCS alone doesn't seem like a silver bullet.
Absolutely. Another avenue they're exploring is biofuels, which are fuels derived from organic matter, like plants or algae. The idea is that these fuels are, in theory, carbon neutral, because the plants absorb CO2 as they grow, offsetting the emissions released when the fuel is burned.
Biofuels.
Yeah.
Huh. I remember seeing something about ExxonMobil experimenting with algae and even liquefied sawdust as potential fuel sources. Is that what we were talking about here?
Exactly. It's like they're trying to turn anything that grows into fuel. The appeal of algae is that it grows quickly and doesn't require arable land, which is important for food security. Liquefied sawdust, on the other hand, utilizes waste products from the timber industry.
It sounds almost too good to be true. Are biofuels really a viable solution?
Yeah.
Or is it more hype than substance?
Well, there are some serious challenges. One is the issue of scale. Growing enough algae or collecting enough sawdust to meet global energy demand is a daunting task. And then there are questions about the overall environmental impact of large-scale biofuel production, particularly when it comes to land use, water consumption, and fertilizer use.
So while biofuels sound promising in theory, there are still a lot of kinks to work out. It seems like ExxonMobil is hedging their bets, trying out a variety of approaches to see what sticks. But I'm curious, what are the critics saying about all of this?
The reactions have been mixed, to say the least. Some applaud their investments in new technologies and acknowledge that even a giant company like ExxonMobil can't shift course overnight. Others are much more skeptical, viewing these efforts as mere greenwashing, a way to maintain a positive public image without fundamentally changing their business model.
It's almost like a tightrope walk. On one side, they're trying to reassure investors that they're adapting to a changing energy landscape. But on the other side, they're facing accusations of not doing enough, fast enough.
You've hit the nail on the head. It's a delicate balancing act, and they're being watched very closely by investors, environmental groups, and the public alike.
So let's say they're successful in developing and deploying these technologies, like CCS and biofuels. Does that mean they can really achieve net zero emissions? Or are there other factors at play here?
That's a great question. And it leads us to the heart of the debate surrounding ExxonMobil's net zero pledge. So are they going to be able to actually make this happen? I mean, can a company like this really shift gears like that?
That's the million-dollar question.
Right.
I mean,
Yeah.
we've talked about ExxonMobil's ambitious net zero goal and some of the technologies they're betting on, like carbon capture and biofuels. But let's be honest, these are long-term plays with a lot of unknowns. What does that mean for their current business and their financial performance? Are they still raking in profits from oil and gas? Or are those golden days coming to an end?
Well, it's not quite a feast or famine situation, but they're definitely in a transition period. While their 2023 annual report does show impressive profits,
Yeah.
driven by high oil and gas prices, they're also facing pressure from investors to invest in cleaner energy, which may not yield the same quick returns. It's a delicate balancing act.
You mentioned investor pressure. What exactly does that look like? Are we talking about angry emails or something a bit more forceful?
It goes beyond strongly worded emails. We're seeing a rise in what's called shareholder activism, where investors use their financial stake to influence corporate decisions. One tactic is divestment campaigns, encouraging institutions to sell off their ExxonMobil stock to send a message. Another is proxy battles, where activist investors try to get their own candidates elected to the board of directors to influence the company from within.
So instead of just cashing dividend checks, these activist investors are trying to steer the ship in a more sustainable direction. But how effective has this been? Have they managed to make any headway?
They've had some notable wins. Jeff Ubben, a well-known activist investor, joined ExxonMobil's board in 2021. He's been a vocal advocate for the energy transition and believes the company needs to evolve to stay competitive in a low-carbon future. His presence on the board signals that shareholder activism is having a tangible impact on ExxonMobil's decision-making.
It's interesting how the push for change is coming, not just from environmental groups, but from within the financial world as well. But let's not forget about ExxonMobil's track record. As a financial powerhouse, what's their current financial situation looking like? Are they still as solid as a rock? Or are there cracks starting to show?
Their balance sheet remains remarkably strong. We're talking about a company with total assets exceeding $350 billion. They have a healthy cash flow, and they've been managing their debt prudently. However, their stock price has been somewhat volatile in recent years, influenced by fluctuating oil prices, geopolitical events, and of course, the growing uncertainties surrounding the energy transition.
So they have a ton of assets and a history of financial stability. But how much of that is tied to the current boom in oil prices?
Yeah.
What happens if demand for fossil fuels starts to decline more rapidly than they anticipate?
That's the multi-billion-dollar question, and it's one that keeps investors and analysts up at night. ExxonMobil's stock performance is inherently linked to the price of oil. When oil prices soar, so does their stock. But when prices plummet, as they inevitably do, their stock takes a hit. The challenge for them is to decouple their fortunes from the volatile oil market and position themselves for a future where demand for fossil fuels may decline.
So it seems like they're walking a tightrope. On one side, they have this legacy of oil and gas production that's still generating huge profits. But on the other side, they have this growing imperative to transition to cleaner energy sources, which comes with a whole new set of risks and uncertainties. What does this mean for their long-term prospects? Can they successfully navigate this transition, or will they become a relic of the fossil fuel era?
That's the big question hanging over ExxonMobil. They have the resources, the expertise, and the scale to potentially become a leader in the clean energy transition. But they also have a legacy to contend with, and their past actions on climate change continue to cast a long shadow.
As we wrap up this deep dive, what key takeaways should our listener keep in mind? What's the big picture here?
ExxonMobil's story is a fascinating microcosm of the global energy landscape. They've evolved from a kerosene king to a global energy giant. And now they're facing the daunting challenge of reinventing themselves yet again. Whether they succeed or fail will have profound implications, not just for the company, but for the entire energy industry and the fight against climate change.
It's a story that's still being written, and one that we'll all be watching closely, from Rockefeller's ruthlessness to the Exxon Valdez spill to their current net zero pledge. ExxonMobil's journey is full of twists, turns, and complexities.
It's a reminder that even the largest, most powerful companies are not immune to the forces of change, and that the transition to a sustainable energy future will require bold action, technological innovation, and perhaps most importantly, a willingness to adapt and learn from past mistakes.
This deep dive has hopefully given you a better understanding of ExxonMobil's complex history and the challenges they face in navigating a world that's demanding cleaner energy solutions. It's a story that's far from over, and it's one that will continue to shape the global energy landscape. for years to come. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into ExxonMobil.